If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. I need to give a content warning. This episode is really heavy. It's probably the heaviest episode that I've ever done. In this episode, I mention sexual assault, mental illness, and suicide. So, usually for episodes that contain content warnings, I give timestamps. So if you want to skip over the heavy stuff, you can. But for this episode, it would be impossible for me to do that. You would basically be skipping over the entire episode. So I am just going to give you this content warning here. If you need to skip this episode, I completely understand. Alright, now let's get into the episode. The tortured artist. One that suffers through great pain and turns that pain into great art. A person that is not often appreciated in their time. Though I don't fully buy into the whole one must suffer for one's art, it is hard to deny that from great pain, great art has sprung. And if you are familiar with the works of Virginia Woolf, but you are not familiar with her life, hopefully these episodes of History Shelf about Virginia Woolf will shine new light on her works for you. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 17th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that, during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So, while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserved to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time, there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was born Adeline Virginia Stephen on January 25th, 1882, in London, England. Since she went by her middle name for her entire life, I'm going to call her Virginia for this episode. Virginia's mother was Julia Princip Jackson, and her father was Sir Leslie Stephen. Both Julia and Leslie were married to other people before they married each other. Julia was first married to Herbert Duckworth, and Leslie was married to Harriet Thackeray. Both Herbert and Harriet died before Julia and Leslie. Julia had 3 children with Herbert. She had George Herbert, Stella, and Gerald. Leslie had 1 daughter with Harriet named Laura Makepeace. Together, Julia and Leslie had 4 children: Vanessa, Julian Thoby, Virginia, and then Adrian Leslie. Virginia was named after her mother's oldest sister, Adeline Maria Jackson, and her mother's aunt, Virginia Paddle. Virginia's aunt Adeline died a year before Virginia was born, and because of that, no one called Virginia Adeline. Virginia was very close with her whole siblings, and they bonded together against their older half-siblings. Though Virginia did become jealous of Adrian for being their mother's favorite, and there was a little bit of sibling rivalry between Virginia and her sister Vanessa. Virginia was raised at 22 Hyde Park Gate. This is how Virginia described the family that she was born into, quote, "Born into a large connection, born not of rich parents, but of well-to-do parents, born into a very communicative, literate, letter-writing, visiting, articulate, late 19th century world," end quote. Virginia's father was an editor, critic, and biographer. His first father-in-law was William Makepeace Thackeray. William was a novelist and illustrator, so Virginia grew up in the literary world. It was nothing to have Henry James, George Henry Lewis, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Thomas Hardy, or Edward Burne-Jones at her house, and her godfather was James Russell Lowell. Beginning in Virginia's very first summer, her and her family would leave 22 Hyde Park Gate, and they would travel to their summer home in St. Ives, Cornwall. There they leased a house known as Talon House. And they would stay there until mid-July to mid-September. Leslie described it as pocket paradise. Virginia loved it as well. She wrote in her diary on March 22nd, 1921, while she was thinking back on a day in August of 1890. She writes, quote, "Why am I so incredibly and incurably romantic about Cornwall? One's past, I suppose. I see children running in the garden, the sounds of the sea at night, so much I could never explain," end quote. Cornwall would inspire Virginia's writing. We can see its influence particularly in Jacob's Room, To the Lighthouse, and The Waves. A childhood hobby of Virginia's was that she liked to hunt butterflies and moths. She would collect insects and pin their lifelike corpses to corkboards with their wings outspread. Another hobby of hers was she loved bookbinding, and she began that in 1901. Not everything in Virginia's life was joy and butterflies. In fact, you are going to find that a lot of Virginia's life was an unhappy one. From at least the year 1888, Virginia started getting sexually abused by her half-brother Gerald. She was only 6 years old at the time. Gerald would have been 17 or 18 years old. When she was in her teens, Virginia's half-brother George started to sexually abuse her as well. I'm not sure how old George would have been at the time he started abusing Virginia, because I don't know for sure at what age Virginia was when George's abuse started. But George was 14 years older than Virginia. Virginia's cousin, James Kenneth Stephen, also sexually abused her. He was 23 years older than her. The abuse that Virginia endured caused her to have lifelong trauma. You can see her suffer the symptoms of the sexual abuse throughout her life, symptoms like emotional distancing or repetitions in behavior. You can even see this reflected in her writing. her fictional characters show signs and symptoms of sexual abuse. She struggled with depression and even insanity for her entire life. It is also believed that Virginia's half-sisters, Laura and Stella, may have also been sexually abused by Gerald, George, and James. It's evident that Virginia loved writing even at an early age. In February of 1891, Virginia started a family newspaper with her sister Vanessa. At the time, Virginia was only 9 years old. The newspaper was called Hyde Park Gate News, and she would often use this newspaper to tease her siblings Vanessa and Adrian. On February 3rd, 1892, Virginia's cousin James Stephen died. James was the cousin that sexually abused Virginia, so there's no real tragedy there. But how he died is kind of interesting. So he was Prince Albert Victor's tutor, and when he learned that Albert died, James stopped eating, and then he died 20 days later. So he starved himself to death. The cause of death that's listed on his death certificate is mania. Another interesting little fact about him is James is a Jack the Ripper suspect. I have seen photos of James, and he has a creepy look to him. Now, I'm not saying that he was, in fact, Jack the Ripper. I don't know. I haven't really dived into that. I just saw that he was a Jack the Ripper suspect. But I'm just saying, he's got a creepy look to him. I want to talk now about another one of Virginia's siblings, Laura. Laura was Virginia's half-sister. Well, one of them. Remember, she was Virginia's father's daughter. Laura's mother was only 30 weeks pregnant with Laura when she gave birth to her. Because of this, Laura had some developmental issues. Laura was seen as a burden by her family, and she was treated differently. Laura can't be found in any of the family portraits. Virginia even rarely wrote about her, even though she wrote often about her other family members. Virginia described Laura as a, quote, vacant girl whose idiocy was becoming daily more obvious, who could hardly read, who would throw scissors into the fire, who was tongue-tied and stammered and yet had to appear at the table with the rest of us, end quote. Virginia eventually goes on to marry a man named Leonard Woolf, and I will talk about him later. But this is what Virginia said in a letter in 1934 when she was talking about deaths in her family and what Leonard had to say about them. Quote, Leonard says Laura is the one we could have spared, end quote. Personally, I think the ones that you could have spared were the child molesters, but that's just my opinion. In Victorian England, people with a mental deficiency were labeled as an imbecile, an idiot, or a lunatic. Laura was labeled as an imbecile. That was the mildest form of congenital mental deficiency. In 1915, this is what Virginia wrote about a group of, quote, imbeciles that walked past her. Quote, they should certainly be killed, end quote. So even though Virginia didn't write much about Laura, and she is not even reflected much in Virginia's fictional writings like other members of Virginia's family are, though there is the mad woman trope that often appears in Virginia's writing. But I think from what Virginia did and didn't say about Laura, we can figure out what she thought about her and people like her. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for Laura growing up in her family. Leslie put a lot of pressure on his children to be perfect. And if Laura was sexually abused by her two stepbrothers and cousin, I can't imagine how she was able to process that. I imagine it probably made her condition worse. Laura's mother died on Leslie's 43rd birthday, and Laura was only 5 years old. Leslie was distraught, and he gave Laura first to his sister-in-law and then to his sister. By the time that Laura was 9, it was obvious that something was wrong. Leslie tried to teach her, but she was slow to talk and slow to read. She shouted and cried and had mood swings that went from extreme fatigue to violent tantrums. Virginia's half-brother George went to Leslie and told him that his mother should not have to care for Laura. Leslie consulted Dr. John Langdon Down. He was the namer of Down syndrome. And the doctor told him that it was unlikely that Laura would progress. So in 1885, Laura was moved to a cottage in the country and a nurse looked after her. Laura only got to see her family on holidays, if at all. After Laura was moved to the cottage, it is the only time when Virginia writes anything positive about Laura. Laura was supposed to visit them in Cornwall on August 8, 1892, but her train was late arriving. Virginia writes that they were disappointed that her train was late, and she said that they gave Laura a hearty welcome. What is confusing about Laura's condition is there was one time that she was heading to Cornwall on a train and she missed her stop. And she got a hotel room and she stayed the night until someone could come get her. Now, Laura was traveling alone, so Laura had to have had some level of competence. But in her family's writings, they portray her as completely incompetent, someone that would howl throughout the night. In 1893, she was moved to Earlswood Asylum. In 1901, Laura was labeled as a lunatic in the census. That meant that Laura had gotten worse. Did she get worse because she was put in the asylum? You do hear horror stories about those places during this time. Or would this have also have happened if she was still at home? I don't know. Laura got visits from her family from time to time when she was at the asylum. When Virginia was putting materials together for her family's biographer, Virginia didn't know how to put Laura into words. She writes, quote, "The history of Laura is really the most tragic thing in his life, I think, and yet I can hardly describe it," end quote. I know that I have spent a little bit of time talking about Laura, and this is not a Laura Steven episode, but I wanted to tell her story. I didn't want her to just be a footnote in someone else's life. That is how she was treated by her family when she was alive. I wanted to treat Laura better, and I knew that I didn't have enough information on her to make an episode all about her. So I told her story here. In February of 1895, Virginia's mother got the flu. She never really recovered from that. Julia died on May 5th, 1895. Julia was 49 years old and Virginia was just 13 years old. Virginia was never the same after her mother's death. This was Virginia's first battle with depression, and depression would be something that she would struggle with for the rest of her life. Virginia said this about her mother, quote, "My first memory, and in fact, it is the most important of all my memories," end quote. You can see Virginia's mother's influence all over Virginia's writing, in her diaries, letters, essays, and even in her fictional work. In To the Lighthouse, the character Mrs. Ramsay is based on Julia. Virginia described her mother's death as, quote, "the greatest disaster that could happen," end quote. After Julia's death, Leslie never went back to the asylum to visit Laura, and the summer visits to Cornwall never happened again. In 1897, Virginia started to keep a diary. Virginia had always loved writing. I already told you that she started a family newspaper, but her love for writing started even before that. She was writing letters by the age of 5. Her parents did not believe in formal education for girls, but they did believe that writing was an alright career path for a woman. Virginia's half-sister Stella kind of took on the role of mother after Julia died, but it wasn't for long, because Stella died on July 19th, 1897, after a long illness. Virginia was 15 years old at the time of Stella's passing. After Stella's death, Virginia started to express the desire to die. After Julia died and Leslie stopped visiting Laura at the asylum, Stella still went to visit her, and so did Laura's Aunt Annie. After Stella died, Annie continued to visit Laura until her death in 1919. When Laura died in 1945, the asylum didn't know of any living relatives that Laura had, even though both Vanessa and Adrian were still alive. From the years 1897 to 1901, Virginia was allowed to go to King's College. There she studied ancient Greek, Latin, German, and continental and English history. She also had private tutors for Greek, German, and Latin. One of her tutors was Janet Case. Janet was a scholar that was a women's rights advocate, and Janet got Virginia involved in the women's rights movement. The loss of Virginia's mother and her half-sister would not be the only pain Virginia would face. Virginia's father became ill in April of 1902. He had surgery later that year, but he never fully recovered. He died on February 22nd, 1904, of bowel cancer. He was 71 years old. Virginia had a complicated relationship with her father. Virginia and Leslie bonded over literature, but she also described him as a tyrant father. She described him as, quote, the exacting, the violent, the histrionic, the administrative, the self-centered, the self-pitying, the deaf, the appealing, the alternatively loved and hated father, end quote. When she was 10, she wrote a poem that places him among major English personages. The poem goes, quote, A is for Prince Albert, so good and so kind. B for the Black Prince, who was never left behind. C for Carlyle, a great author was he. D for Drake, who sailed over the sea. E for Miss Edgeworth, who wrote many books. F for the Frenchmen, who take care of their looks. G for Goliath, so great and so strong. H, the eighth Henry, who to his wives did great wrong. I for Hal Irving, a painstaking actor. J for Sam Johnson, your mind's benefactor. K for John Keats, a poet of merits. L for Sir Lawson, who puts down the spirits. M for Lord Macaulay, who wrote the laws of Rome. N for Nelson, before whom the French have flown. O for Will Owen, who portrays did. P for William Pitt, who was minister to the state. Q for John Quick, who acted in plays. R for Hal Rayburn, well known his ways. S for Leslie Stephen, well known to you. T for Hal Taylor, a poet so true. U for James Usher, Archbishop was he. V Victoria, Queen to you and me. W for Watts, painter is he. X for Xerxes, murdered BC. Y for Miss Young, who many things can tell. Z for Zuckert, who played chess very well. End quote. She wrote that poem, titled An Easy Alphabet for Infants, when her father retired from his job as the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. Virginia, in her later life, looked back and blamed the encyclopedia for her suffering. Of course, the encyclopedia was a symbol for her father. She writes, quote, Lord, what a bore! To think that my father's philosophy in the Dictionary of National Biography cost me this. I never see those 68 black books without cursing them for all the jaunts they've lost me. End quote. She also writes this, quote, "She, her mother, has haunted me, but then so did that old wretch my father. But he was an adorable man and somehow tremendous," end quote. Virginia described the years following the deaths of Stella and her father as the 7 unhappy years. On May 10, 1904, Virginia tried to commit suicide by throwing herself out of a window. She was briefly institutionalized under the care of her father's friend, psychiatrist George Savage. She spent some time at Stella's friend Violet Dickinson's house and at her aunt's, Caroline Stevenson's house. I have no idea if Violet is related to history alumni Emily Dickinson. In January of 1905, George said that Virginia had been cured. After Virginia's father died, the Stevens did some traveling with their half-brother George. They went to France and Italy. While they were traveling was when Virginia tried to kill herself. When she recovered, she moved into the new home that Vanessa had purchased for them. They wanted to get away from all of the deaths, so they sold 22 Hyde Park Gate, and Vanessa purchased 46 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury. Virginia's brother, Julian, that went by his middle name Thoby, often had his college friends over at the house. Thoby, his siblings, and his friends became known as the Bloomsbury Group. This group had Virginia, Thoby, Vanessa, Adrian, Saxon Sidney Turner, Lytton Strachey, Clive Bell, Desmond McCartney, John Maynard Keynes, Duncan Grant, E.M. Forster, Roger Fry, David Garnett, Gwen Darwin, Catherine Lard Cox, John Nash, Henry Lamb, Edward Wadsworth, and Leonard Woolf in it. This was a group of artists and intellectuals. There were 2 different sets of people in this group. There were the writers and there were the artists. The writers group met on Thursdays. They met for drinks and conversation. The Friday club was for the artists. Vanessa started that group. She was a painter. This group was unconventional for its time. They were more known for their controversial ideas and lifestyles than they were for their art. They didn't like the conventions of the time. They were politically liberal and they craved freedom to come up with their own ideas and lifestyles. They had liberal ideas on sex that led to some complicated relationships and affairs. Think of the Bloomsbury Group as upper-class Victorian English hippies. On the evening of November 17, 1904, Virginia formally met a man that was a part of the group named Leonard Woolf. He was a college friend of Thoby's, and he had joined the Stevens for dinner on that mid-November evening. He was having dinner with them so he could say goodbye. He was taking a position with the civil service in Ceylon. I am sure while Virginia was enjoying her meal that evening, she had no idea that she was sitting at the table with a man that would one day become her husband. In 1905, Virginia went on vacation with Adrian to Portugal and Spain, and she began teaching evening classes at Morley College. Virginia had no idea that there was another tragedy that was on the horizon. In 1906, Thoby took a vacation to Greece. There he contracted typhoid fever. He made it back to England, but he died on November 20th, 1906. He was just 26 years old. Vanessa married Clive Bell in 1907. That meant that Virginia and Adrian had to find a new home. Virginia moved to 29 Fitzroy Square in April of 1907. It wasn't far from Gordon Square. The Thursday Club started to conduct their meeting at Virginia and Adrian's home in October of 1907. She remained close to Vanessa even after she moved. She even accompanied Vanessa, Clive, and Vanessa's newborn son, Julian, to Italy and France in September of 1908. In 1909, Leonard Woolf proposed to Virginia, but she didn't tell him yes, but she didn't tell him no either. She actually didn't tell him anything at all. In 1910, Virginia started working on her first novel, Melambrosia. It would come to be called The Voyage Out. This novel is about self-discovery and it satirizes Edwardian life. It was published in 1915. On February 7, 1910, Virginia was involved in the Dreadnought hoax. This was a prank that was born out of boredom. The masterminds of the prank were Adrian and his friend Horace de Vere Cole. They first got the idea to impersonate German officers. They were going to get some uniforms and march a detachment of troops across the border into France. It was a half political statement, half pure fun. Adrian wrote about the prank, quote, "It had seemed to me ever since I was very young, just as I imagine it had seemed to Cole, that anyone who took up an attitude of authority over anyone else was necessarily also someone who offered a leg for everyone else to pull. And of all the institutions in the world that offered a leg for everyone's pulling, the most obvious was the German army." End quote. Horace came up with a plan that was cheaper and easier. When the men were coming up with this prank, the Sultan of Zanzibar was in England. So they thought that it would be funny if they would impersonate the Sultan and pay the mayor of Cambridge a visit. But people knew what the Sultan Sayyid Ali bin Hamad Ab Based looked like. His picture had been in the paper and neither Adrian or Horace looked like him. But no one knew what the Sultan's uncle looked like. So they thought that they would impersonate him. On March 2nd, 1905, they sent a telegram to the mayor of Cambridge, Algernon S. Campkin. This is what the telegram said. Quote, "The Sultan of Zanzibar will arrive today at Cambridge at 4:27 for a short visit. Could you arrange to show him buildings of interest and send carriage? Henry Lucas, Hotel Cecil, London." End quote. The men went to a theatrical shop in London. There they got full makeup and costume. Then they took the train back to Cambridge. They were formally received by the mayor. They went with him to a charity bazaar. Horace, as the Sultan's uncle, made enormous purchases at all of the stalls. They pulled off the hoax. The Daily Mail newspaper even wrote a story about it. Then an investigator did some digging. They were caught and almost expelled from Cambridge. But that didn't stop them from coming up with another plan. This plan would involve Virginia. Neither Adrian or Horace came up with the plan. The prank was actually suggested to Horace by a naval officer. That officer wanted to make a statement about the honor of the Royal Navy, and he also wanted to play a practical joke on another officer. That officer just happened to be Virginia and Adrian's cousin. So here was the plan. Adrian and Horace got together a group of people that also didn't mind to play a practical joke on the Royal Navy. The group was Duncan Grant, British soldier and author Anthony Buxton, barrister Cecil Guy Ridley, and Virginia. They were going to present themselves as the Emperor of Abyssinia, that's modern-day Ethiopia, and his posse. Then they would go inspect the battleship. Horace was a young gentleman from the Foreign Office, Adrian was the interpreter, Anthony Buxton was the emperor, and the rest of the gang were his royal suit. Adrian writes this, quote, "Horace Cole had just to wear a top hat and tailcoat, but the emperor and his suit, including Virginia, had to have their faces blackened to wear false beards and mustaches and elaborate Easter robes. I was merely disguised with a false beard, a mustache, and a little sunburn powder. I wore a bowler hat and a greatcoat and looked, I'm afraid, like a seedy commercial traveler." End quote. There is a picture of all of them dressed in their costumes and makeup. Virginia is in brown face, which please don't do that today, but you have to see this picture. I will put a picture of it on TikTok and Instagram either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So, after they got their looks together, they sent the Admiral a telegram to expect them. Though the newspapers would later report that the group spoke fluent Abyssinian, that was not true. Horace tried to teach Adrian Swahili. It was the only East African language that they could find, even though it wasn't actually spoken in Abyssinia. Horace was not a successful teacher. They were greeted by a naval officer when they got off the train. Adrian got worried when he got on the ship. The captain of the ship was someone that he knew, but he wasn't inspected too closely. The admiral asked Adrian to translate something about the fleet's use for the emperor. He just spoke in gibberish. When they were asked to join the officers for lunch, the group panicked a little. They didn't want to mess up their makeup, so they told them that the royal family could only touch food prepared in certain ways. Then a breeze and drizzle came, so they told them that England was much colder than Abyssinia. So the captain took them downstairs. Adrian refused a military salute because he knew that it would be a hassle to clean the guns, and he thought that it would be, quote, too much of a shame to cause such unnecessary trouble, end quote. The group was able to pull off another hoax. They thought that was that. Then Adrian saw a picture of them in their costume and makeup on a poster. Someone had told the press. Adrian thought that it was Horace. The captain laughed about it when he saw Adrian and Horace in the street, but not everyone thought that it was funny. Parliament demanded for the names of the other people that he pulled the prank off with, and they wanted an apology. The hoax had become the talk of the town. There was a song written about it to the tune of "The Girl I Left Behind." I'm not going to sing you that song. You're welcome. But I will read it to you. Quote, "When I went on board a dreadnought ship, I looked like a costermonger. They said I was an Abyssinian prince because I shouted bunga bunga." End quote. The Navy officers wanted revenge for being fooled. Some showed up at Horace's door. They wanted to beat him with a cane, but he was recovering from an illness, so they didn't think that it would be fair. So they came to an agreement. They could give him 6 ceremonial taps to his ass if he could do the same. Then the next day, they went to Duncan Grant, and they wanted to hit him with a cane. They asked him if he was sick. They were taken aback by the fact that he wasn't putting up a fight. Virginia's cousin could not hit a man that wasn't putting up a fight, but he was okay with ordering his inferior to do it. The officer gave him 2 ceremonial taps to his ass. Virginia was not punished for her involvement in the hoax, but she did use it as an inspiration for her short story, A Society. And in 1940, she called it the most daring hoax in history. She talked about the hoax in a lecture that she gave at the Women's Institution in Rodmell. In the end of February of 1910, Virginia hit a low. George Savage said that she needed to get away from London, so Vanessa rented a house outside Canterbury. By June, Virginia was not better, so George said that she needed a rest cure. He sent her to Burleigh House, that was a private nursing home for women with nervous disorder. There, Virginia was partially isolated, wasn't allowed any literature, and she was force-fed. After 6 weeks, she was able to convalesce in Cornwall and Dorset. Virginia hated it. She wrote to Vanessa on July 28th, telling her how much she hated it. She didn't like the religious atmosphere of the place, and she did not want to be sent back. The threat of being sent back made her contemplate suicide. Despite this, George sent her back in 1912 for insomnia, and he sent her back again in 1913 for depression. When she was released from Burleigh House in September of 1913, 2 physicians, Maurice Wright and Henry Head, recommended that she return to Burleigh House. So she went home and she tried to kill herself for the 2nd time. This time she took an overdose and she nearly died. She would go on to overdose again on November 18th, 1913, though she said that time it was an accident. In April of 1914, she found a psychiatrist that would actually listen to her. His name was Maurice Craig, and he said that she was not sufficiently psychotic to be certified and she should not be institutionalized. In 1910, Virginia found herself in need of the country. So on December 24th, 1910, she started leasing a house in Firle, Sussex, and she bought it the next month. When Virginia moved to Firle, she met a man named Rupert Brooke. He was a poet. He was a part of a social circle nicknamed the Neo-Pagans. This group was into socialism, vegetarianism, exercising outdoors, and engaging in alternative lifestyle choices like social nudity. Virginia partook in some of their activities. Virginia was interested in their simple life. It was a vast contrast to the intellectualism of the Bloomsbury group. Her involvement in the Neo-Pagans group led Adrian to giving her the nickname the Goat. And that's where I'm going to end this episode. I think that I can tell Virginia's story in 2 episodes. I may need 3, but I'm pretty sure I can do it in 2. Next week, I will start the episode with telling you about Virginia's marriage to her husband, Leonard Woolf. Thank you so much for listening to the 17th episode of the 4th season. I am covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be Virginia Woolf Part 2. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give you a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. With that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of things mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. I also have some affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch or any of the perks and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I've turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But As always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.